In 1943, Nikola Tesla died alone in a New York hotel room. The official report said natural causes, no investigation, no suspicion, just another aging inventor at the end of his life. But Grok AI analyzed the timeline, the documents, and the actions taken in the hours after his death and found something that doesn't fit. Because Tesla didn't just die, his work vanished, and it didn't disappear slowly. It was taken. Within hours, government agents entered his room, removed every document, every notebook, every piece of research he had been working on. Not reviewed publicly, not released, seized. And that only happens when someone was working on something that wasn't meant to be seen. In January 1943, the world believed Nikola Tesla was finished. Once celebrated as one of the greatest minds in electrical engineering, that he had faded into the background. His early achievements, alternating current, wireless energy concepts, high voltage experimentation, were already shaping modern civilization. But by the end of his life, he was seen as a relic, a brilliant mind that had gone too far into theory, too far into ideas that the world wasn't ready for or didn't believe in. But Grok AI didn't look at reputation, it looked at patterns, and the pattern around Tesla's death doesn't match the story. Because when someone truly becomes irrelevant, they fade quietly. No urgency, no intervention, no immediate response. But Tesla's death triggered the opposite. Within hours, officials moved in. Not journalists, not historians, government authorities. The Office of Alien Property took control of everything in his room. Trunks filled with research, personal notes, the technical sketches. Years of work, gone. Zroki calculated the probability of that response being routine for a civilian death at under 2%, which means this wasn't routine, it was targeted. Then Groki moved deeper, not into what was taken, because that data is incomplete, but into what Tesla was working on before he died, because that's where the real signal is. Tesla's final years weren't empty. They weren't the ramblings of a fading genius. They were focused, structured, directed. His writings show consistency in one area above all others: atmospheric energy. Not electricity in wires, not power plants, energy in the air. Tesla believed the earth itself could function as a conductor, that the atmosphere wasn't empty, it was active, responsive, capable of carrying energy across vast distances. And most people hear this and think of wireless electricity. And yes, that was part of it. But Groki identified something more important buried inside his descriptions. Tesla wasn't just trying to transmit energy. He was trying to interact with the system that energy moves through. And that system is the atmosphere. Grok compared Tesla's language to modern atmospheric physics. Terms like resonance, conductivity, charge distribution, and energy amplification appear repeatedly in both. Not as vague similarities, but as structural parallels. Tesla described the Earth as a giant electrical body. He described the atmosphere as a layer capable of storing and transmitting energy. He described methods of introducing energy into that system and amplifying it through resonance. And that's the key word, resonance. Because resonance isn't just about sending energy, it's about controlling how systems respond. If you introduce energy at the right frequency, at the right point, the system doesn't just absorb it, it reacts. And when the system you're interacting with is the atmosphere, reaction becomes influence. Groki identified this as the first major shift. Tesla wasn't building a machine to create weather. He was studying how to influence the underlying conditions that create it. Small inputs, large effects, because weather itself isn't random. It's driven by variables: pressure, temperature, electrical charge, energy distribution. Change those variables, even slightly, and the outcome changes. Not instantly, not predictably, but measurably. Tesla understood systems, and Grok's analysis shows he was applying that understanding to the sky. Then came the second anomaly: funding. Publicly, Tesla had lost financial support. Investors pulled out. Projects collapsed. But Groke traced indirect financial patterns connected to Tesla's later years. Not large amounts, not public investments. Small, consistent funding streams. enough to continue working, but not enough to attract attention. Groke flagged these as high probability, indirect institutional sources, not commercial, not private investors, something else, which means Tesla wasn't abandoned. He was being quietly supported, and people don't fund failure, they fund potential. Then Groke analyzed Tesla's statements in his final years, interviews where he described systems that could transmit energy globally, systems that could direct power, systems that could influence entire regions. At the time, the journalists dismissed these claims as exaggeration, but Groke removed the bias. It treated Tesla's words as data, and when those data points were mapped against emerging scientific understanding, especially in ionospheric research, they aligned, not perfectly, but consistently. Tesla wasn't imagining things. He was describing early-stage interaction with atmospheric energy systems, and that leads to the third anomaly, timing. Because Tesla didn't just describe these ideas once, he returned to them repeatedly in his final years. That level of consistency suggests focus, not speculation, and focus means progress, not necessarily completion, but movement. Groke's probability model shows that the likelihood Tesla was working on something with real-world application and atmospheric interaction is high, not proven, but statistically supported. And that changes the context of everything that happened after his death. Because when someone reaches a threshold of discovery, especially in systems that affect energy, communication, or environment, history follows a pattern. The work doesn't disappear randomly, it gets absorbed. Tesla didn't just die, he reached a point where what he knew had value beyond his lifetime. And Groke's analysis supports that conclusion. The probability that all of Tesla's final work was insignificant is extremely low, which means something he was working on mattered a lot. And the way it was handled after his death proves it, because irrelevant work doesn't get seized. Irrelevant ideas don't get hidden. Irrelevant people don't trigger immediate intervention. Tesla wasn't irrelevant. He was early, too early. And that's the moment where innovation becomes something else, something that doesn't just change technology, but has the potential to change control. And once that line is crossed, the story is no longer about the inventor. It's about what happens to the idea. After Nikola Tesla died, the official story tried to end everything quickly. His work was reviewed by a physicist named John G. Trump. The conclusion was simple, clean, and final. Nothing of importance. No revolutionary discoveries, no working systems, no threat. Just incomplete ideas and theoretical concepts. Case closed. But Groke AI didn't accept conclusions. It checked whether the conclusion matched the pattern. And it didn't, because nothing about the events surrounding Tesla's death aligns with the idea that his work was insignificant. Groke mapped the sequence again. A man publicly dismissed as irrelevant receives quiet funding. That same man dies, and within hours, government authorities seize everything he owned. His research is immediately reviewed under controlled conditions, and the final public statement is that nothing valuable existed. Groke calculated the probability of that sequence being accurate at under 0.5%, which means the conclusion doesn't match the behavior. And when conclusions don't match behavior, the conclusion is usually incomplete. So Groke shifted focus. Instead of asking what Tesla built, it asked a more important question: what happened after his work was taken? Because knowledge, especially useful knowledge, doesn't disappear. It moves, it evolves, it reappears in different forms. Groke analyzed the decades following 1943, looking for patterns that match Tesla's concepts. Not exact replicas, because direct replication would be obvious, but conceptual similarities. And the first major signal appeared in the ionospheric research, starting in the late 1940s and accelerating through the 1950s. Scientific attention toward the upper atmosphere increased dramatically. Governments began investing in understanding how energy behaves above the Earth, not just radio signals, but energy itself, how it travels, how it reflects, how it interacts with charged layers in the atmosphere. Groke compared the language used in early ionospheric research papers to Tesla's earlier writings. Terms like resonance, conductivity, energy propagation, and frequency alignment appeared in both. not copied word for word, but structurally consistent, which means the ideas didn't originate from nothing. They had a source. Then Groke analyzed timing, because timing reveals intention. If a new field of research suddenly accelerates right after a key figure's work is confiscated, that overlap isn't random. Groke's probability model shows that independent discovery at that scale within that time frame is statistically unlikely, which suggests influence, not direct proof, but directional evidence. Tesla didn't need to build the final system. He only needed to identify the pathway, and once that pathway exists, others can follow it, quietly, systematically, without credit. Then came the second layer of analysis, patents. Groke scanned patent databases across multiple decades, looking for technologies that align with Tesla's concepts, not exact matches, because anything too obvious would be visible, but underlying frameworks, wireless transmission, atmospheric interaction, high-frequency energy systems, and the pattern appeared again. Not one breakthrough, not one invention, but multiple developments across different timelines that share conceptual DNA with Tesla's ideas. Groke identified overlapping structures in how these systems were described. The same logic, the same approach, the same assumptions about how energy behaves in large-scale systems. Individually, each development could be coincidence, but when mapped together, the probability of coincidence drops below 3%, which means the pattern is real. Now here's where the narrative shifts, because this isn't about Tesla building a weather control machine. That idea is too simple, too literal. Groke's analysis doesn't support the idea of direct control. What it supports is something more complex and more realistic. The Tesla was exploring how to influence systems, not dominate them. Influence is subtle. It doesn't require total control. It requires understanding where to apply pressure, where to introduce energy, where to create imbalance. Because systems, especially large systems like the atmosphere, amplify small inputs over time. A slight change in energy distribution can lead to measurable changes in outcomes, not instantly, but progressively. Groke modeled this using system-based probability analysis. When small energy inputs are introduced into a dynamic system at specific points, the system responds disproportionately over time. This is how storms form. This is how pressure shifts escalate. This is how localized changes become large-scale events. Tesla understood this, and that's what makes his work significant. So not because he could create weather, but because he could potentially influence the conditions that lead to it. Then Groke analyzed institutional behavior, because patterns repeat. When discoveries have large-scale implications, energy systems, communication networks, environmental influence, they follow a predictable trajectory. Discovery, suppression, integration, control. Tesla's work fits this model almost perfectly. Discovery during his lifetime, suppression at the moment of his death, integration through subsequent research programs, and control hidden within systems that people don't question, not visible, not obvious, but present. Groke also identified another anomaly: silence, not the absence of discussion, but the absence of acknowledgement. Tesla's early work is celebrated. His contributions to electricity are widely known. But his later work, his ideas about atmospheric energy, resonance, and large-scale transmission, are rarely explored in detail. Not dismissed, not disproven, simply ignored. And ignoring something is often more effective than disproving it, because what isn't discussed doesn't attract attention. Then came the third layer of analysis: financial networks. Groke traced indirect funding structures associated with early atmospheric research programs, not direct links to Tesla, but overlapping institutions. The same types of organizations, the same funding patterns, the same low visibility financial behavior that supported Tesla in his final years, which suggests continuity, not of the man, but of the interest in his ideas. And that leads to the real conclusion of part 2. Tesla's work didn't need to be complete to matter. It only needed to point in the right direction. Groke's analysis shows that he identified something about energy and the atmosphere that others later pursued, not publicly, not openly, but consistently, across decades, across different research areas, across multiple systems. The pattern holds, so the question changes. It's no longer, did Tesla control the weather? That question is too simplistic. The real question is, did Tesla discover principles that could lead to atmospheric influence? And Grok's answer is clear. High probability, not certainty, but strong enough to matter. Strong enough to explain why his work was taken. Strong enough to explain why similar ideas reappear later. And strong enough to explain why the narrative around his final years remains incomplete, because history doesn't erase ideas that don't matter. It only erases ideas that arrive too early. Now, Grok AI moved into its final layer of analysis, and this is where the entire story stops being about Nikola Tesla as a person and starts becoming about impact. Because the question was never really, what did Tesla build? The question is, what did Tesla discover that others continue? Grok shifted from historical reconstruction to predictive modeling. It stopped looking at Tesla's life and started analyzing what his ideas would mean if they were even partially correct. Not complete systems, not finished machines, just principles, because principles scale. And when Grok ran simulations based on Tesla's descriptions of atmospheric energy interaction, the results followed a consistent pattern. Small inputs into large systems produce amplified outputs over time, not instantly, not in a controlled, predictable way, but consistently enough to matter. And that's the key difference between control and influence. Control requires precision. Influence requires understanding. Tesla wasn't trying to press a button and create storms. He was studying how to interact with the variables that lead to them. Pressure gradients, energy distribution, electrical charge in the atmosphere. These are not static systems. They are dynamic, constantly shifting, constantly reacting. And when energy is introduced into that system in the right way, at the right time, the system doesn't stay the same. It evolves. Grok's simulations showed that even minimal interference at key points could alter outcomes over extended periods. Not dramatically, not obviously, but measurably. And measurable change in a system as large as Earth's atmosphere becomes significant over time. Grok then expanded the model further. It analyzed how such influence, even if limited, would affect real-world systems, agriculture, communication, climate patterns, military strategy. Because once you understand that the atmosphere is not just a passive layer, but an active system, the implications multiply. Weather is not just something that happens, it's something that emerges from interacting variables. And interacting variables can be influenced. Grok calculated that even a low-level ability to alter atmospheric energy distribution would have cascading effects across multiple sectors. Crop yields could shift, storm paths could adjust, communication systems relying on atmospheric reflection could be enhanced or disrupted. And none of this requires full control. It only requires consistent influence at the right scale. And that's where Tesla's work becomes dangerous, not because it proves anything definitively, but because it points toward a possibility that cannot be ignored. Then Grok analyzed modern systems, not to prove continuation, but to identify conceptual overlap. Atmospheric research programs, energy transmission experiments, high-frequency signal testing, none of these directly claim to influence weather. But when mapped against Tesla's earlier concepts, the structural similarities are clear. Systems designed to interact with the ionosphere. Systems designed to transmit energy across large distances. Systems designed to study how energy behaves in the upper layers of the atmosphere. Individually, each program has a defined purpose, but collectively, they form a network of research that aligns with Tesla's original direction. Grok's probability model shows that the overlap is too consistent to dismiss, not proof of continuation, but strong evidence of conceptual lineage. And then came the most important layer, behavior. Because technology alone doesn't define significance, behavior does. Grok analyzed how institutions respond to discoveries with large-scale implications. The pattern is consistent across history. When a discovery has the potential to disrupt systems of control, energy, communication, environment, it is rarely released fully and immediately. Instead, it follows a path. Restricted access, controlled development, gradual integration, limited public understanding. Tesla's work fits that pattern, not because it was confirmed, but because it was treated as if it mattered. The speed of the seizure after his death, the silence around his later research, the emergence of related concepts in controlled environments, the absence of public continuation of his most advanced ideas. These are not random, they form a behavioral pattern, and Groth's analysis assigns high probability to that pattern being intentional rather than accidental. Then Groth asked the final question, not what happened to Tesla, but what survived him. Because ideas don't need the original creator to continue. They only need someone else to recognize their value. Groth's conclusion is not that Tesla built a system capable of controlling weather. That claim cannot be proven with available data. But that's not the point. The conclusion is that Tesla identified principles that made atmospheric influence theoretically possible. For principles that were later explored, refined, and integrated into broader systems of research. Principles that were significant enough to trigger immediate intervention at the time of his death, and that changes the story completely, because it means Tesla wasn't a failure. He wasn't a forgotten genius, lost in his own ideas. He was an early signal, someone who reached a level of understanding before the world was ready to apply it. And when that happens, history doesn't celebrate it immediately. It absorbs it, quietly, systematically, without acknowledgement. Groth's final probability breakdown reflects that reality. The likelihood that Tesla's final research had no real-world significance is extremely low. The likelihood that his ideas influenced future developments in atmospheric and energy systems is high. The likelihood that key elements of his work were removed from public access is also high. Not certainty, not proof, but patterns supported by data. And patterns don't require belief. They only require consistency. Tesla's story is not about a single invention. It's about a direction, a shift in understanding from isolated systems to interconnected ones, from controlling devices to influencing environments, from generating energy to interacting with the systems that carry it. And once that shift happens, the implications extend far beyond one person. Because the moment humanity begins to understand how to influence large-scale systems, everything changes. Not overnight, not visibly, but structurally. Energy becomes less about generation and more about distribution. Weather becomes less about randomness and more about variables. So control becomes less about force and more about positioning. Tesla stood at the edge of that shift, and Groth's analysis suggests he saw further than anyone else at the time. Not far enough to complete it, but far enough to start it. And that's why his death matters. Not because of how he died, but because of what happened to what he knew. Because if his work had no value, it would have been left behind, ignored, forgotten. Instead, it was taken, silently, immediately, completely. And that's the part of the story that doesn't fit the official version. Because people don't hide things that don't matter. They only hide things that arrive too early. And if Tesla's ideas about atmospheric interaction were even partially correct, then the real story isn't that he failed. It's that he reached a point where what he understood had implications beyond his lifetime. Implications that others continue to explore. Implications that may still be developing. And implications that most people were never meant to fully understand. Because the difference between invention and influence is the difference between building something and changing everything.